This video is called Working Through Thick and Thin, and it's the 11th video in Chapter 4 of Google SketchUp for Dummies. This video, I want to talk about faces and edges. Let's extrude this up into a box. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some edges here. Now, in SketchUp's default drawing style, and you'll learn all about styles later on, but basically in this style, what we've got is two different kinds of edges. We've got this kind of edge right here, which is thin, and we've got this kind of edge over here, which is thick. Now, you can change the relative thinness and thickness of these edges the way that they appear if you want, but the main reason for having thin edges and thick edges is so that you can tell how those edges are relating to the faces that they're on. So let's try something here. I'm going to get the line tool, and I'm going to go from here to here on this face. And you know at this point what's happened, right? I've taken that, and what I've done is I've split that face in half by using this edge right here, right? And the way that I know that is because that edge appears nice and thin. Watch what happens if I undo that edge. What I'm going to do is draw that edge again, but I'm going to make sure that that edge isn't actually ending at the other side of the box on that edge. What I've done is I've actually crossed this edge with the edge that I just drew. And notice how that line is thick now? So let's draw another edge over here that looks thin. Okay, so what I've got here is a thin edge and a thick edge. And watch what happens. If I take the push-pull tool and hover over this side, what you'll see is that this thin edge is actually splitting that face, but this thick edge is absolutely not splitting that face. And that's because the thick edge is actually just sitting on top of the face. Now, if I want to make that thick edge sink in, what I have to do is use the line tool to retrace it from there to there. And when I do that, it becomes a thin edge, and now, lo and behold, I have three faces on the top of this shape that I can extrude however I like. Okay. When it comes to thick edges and thin edges, there are a couple different reasons that edges can appear thick when you didn't really mean for them to appear thick. And one of those is just very simply, if you've got an edge, I hit escape to stop drawing there. If you have an edge that's open, this is called I believe it's called a free edge. If it's open like that, if it's free, meaning one of the ends isn't connected to anything, it's always going to be thick. Basically, edges can't cut through faces unless they're part of another face that's actually cutting into that face. So did you see that? When I connected the end of this edge with an edge to another edge, then the whole thing gets thin. So very simply, when you're drawing edges on a face, before they start cutting into anything, they're always going to look thick. But as soon as you finish that loop of edges, they'll actually look thin for you, and you'll be able to do all the push-pulling and stuff that you want to do, or cutting, or any of that stuff. Okay, let's undo a few steps. Another reason that an edge can look thick is something actually we just alluded to a couple of steps ago. If I draw an edge like this, and then I cut across that edge with another edge, what's happened is the second edge that I drew looks thick. And that's because you can't split an edge with another edge. So once again, if I want to make that edge sink in, so if I want to make it actually be cutting this face, watch what happens if I use the push-pull tool. See? The only two faces I have on top of this box are the ones that are defined by this edge right here. This edge right now is just sitting on top. It's just icing as far as SketchUp's concerned. If I use the line tool to retrace one of those edges, what's going to happen is it's going to sink in. And I have to retrace both of them to make both of them sink in. But now that I did that, I can use push-pull to my heart's content to actually split this thing up into 4 different pieces. And you'll see that that's how it worked. Now, there's something that I forgot to mention in the book, actually, and it can be another reason that edges don't sink in. Watch this. I'm going to turn this whole thing into what's called a group. Now, we haven't covered groups yet in the book. Chapter 5 starts to talk about groups and components and other groupings of geometry. But look what happens if, now that this thing is a group, I take the line tool and draw an edge on top of it. So even though I went from one edge to another edge, just like I was supposed to, you see how that edge looks thick? And that's actually a super frustrating thing for a lot of people when they first start using SketchUp. They make groups and components like they're supposed to, and then they start drawing, and they don't realize that the edges that they're drawing are drawn on top of the group and not inside the group. So watch this. If I double-click on this group, you'll see that the edge that I drew before is gray, meaning it's outside of the group. So imagine what I did is I made a box, I made that into a group, and then I started drawing on top of that box. And what I draw is always going to look thick because it's not actually cutting into the stuff that's in the group. That's part of the reason you make a group or a component in the first place. So what you should take away from that is if you're doing everything right and you think that, like in this case, if you think that this edge that you drew there should actually be cutting through and it's not cutting through, chances are what you're doing is drawing on top of a group or component and you didn't realize you were. So if you want to draw inside that, you just double click and then you get the line tool. And now that I'm inside, I can draw a nice thin edge that actually cuts that face in half. So that's a pretty fundamental thing to know in SketchUp. That is the end of that video for Chapter 4 in Google SketchUp for Dummies.